today. We are excited to have Niva Kramek from EPA. She's an Associate Chief of the Existing Chemicals Branch in EPA's Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention. And she's going to be giving us an update on TSCA Section 6 implementation. So I will turn it over to Niva. Welcome.
Hello, thank you. Thank you. And yes, again, this is Niva Kramek. I'm the Associate Chief of the Existing Chemicals Branch at EPA, and I'm here to talk to you about TSCA and how we're really interested in getting you involved in what we're working on. So I'm going to share my slides, and let me just turn it on just a second. Okay, and you all could let me know. You should be able to just see my screen. Toxic Substances Control Act, Section 6 implementation.
Yep, we can see it. Looks good.
Can see
awesome.
That.
Thanks. Okay. And so you've got my name there. I didn't include contact information, but if anyone does want to email me afterwards, that'd be great. It's kramek.niva@epa.gov. And I do have at the end a lot of web links where you can find information on what we're doing and also our chemical leads for each of the chemicals that I'm going to very quickly mention if you want to get in touch with them or find out more about anything specific. So I'm just going to jump right in. A lot to cover, a short amount of time, and I definitely want to leave time for questions. So here we go. Slide 2. So today, what I'd like to do is provide some background information on TSCA, specifically on Section 6 and what is relevant to small businesses and technical providers and people like you. And I really want to focus on the upcoming opportunities for engagement and what you should expect, because we're doing a ton of work and a lot more than usual. If you haven't been engaged with TSCA before, now is really the time because there's a lot going on and it's going to keep growing and growing. So before jumping into the presentation, I want to launch a poll. I think the one that's scheduled for slide number 2, there's a couple of questions, so please do that. And the question is basically, how familiar are you with us, with TSCA, the risk evaluation process, existing chemicals? I know a lot of you are very experienced and most people are not, even people in the environmental field. So let's see what we've got. Well, I'm looking at the results. This is really awesome. Can people see the results as they're coming in?
Yep, we can see
the
percentages, who's answering who's responding to which one.
Great. Great, this is so exciting. We typically don't do meetings by Zoom, and so a lot of this is new, and I'm really enjoying it. Okay, great. Well, that is really interesting to see, and I'm glad that people are somewhat familiar, but still more to learn, and hopefully you'll get something from this presentation. But I know a little familiar is actually how I started my job, and TSCA has not been something that got a lot of attention, particularly with a lot of the other issues that people are working on. So I'm going to give some background on the 2016 amendments, and then I'm focusing on existing chemicals, the chemicals that have been in commerce since 1976 and that we're working on now. And then I'm going to really focus on what we're doing for risk management and how you can be involved in some of our next steps, because we really want to engage you, focus on transparency, and get your input on what we're doing now. So as a very brief background, TSCA was signed into law originally in 1976, and there were a lot of things that it covered, but what I'm focusing on are the chemicals that have been in commerce since 1976. We call them existing chemicals, and we regulate them under Section 6. And for about 30 years, EPA has not really used Section 6 that much. If you're familiar with asbestos and PCBs, yes, there has been a lot going on. Also lead and things that are specifically named in the statute. But in terms of regulating the chemicals that people are using, in contrast to new chemicals that come through the pipeline, there hasn't been a lot of activity. And in response, there was a patchwork of state chemical regulations. What happened in 2016 was the Lautenberg Act, and that updated TSCA and it amended it. It was signed on June 22nd, 2016, and so a lot of our deadlines are always tied to that mid-June date and became effective immediately. And basically it had overwhelming support because it fixed a lot of the things that really needed to be updated since the 70s. And it got support from the chemical industry, from chemical users, NGOs, and other stakeholders. There was a lot in there for everyone. And obviously nobody ended up fully happy, but it really did refresh and renew what we'd been working on under TSCA. Now, in terms of existing chemicals, one of the biggest changes was we got a mandatory duty to evaluate existing chemicals. We'd always had the authority to investigate and then regulate the chemicals, but what the amendments did was they put us on a schedule. Right now we are evaluating 10 chemicals, very quickly moving on to 20, and it is a risk-based evaluation without consideration of costs or non-risk factors. What's very interesting is once an unreasonable risk from those chemicals is identified, we do have to move immediately to rulemaking. And that was the other big update in the statute. It had always been a question, and it's a good one. What should EPA do when an unreasonable risk is identified? There's a lot of great voluntary programs. There's a lot of ways you can address the unreasonable risk. Well, Congress decided that the unreasonable risk must be addressed by a regulation within a very, very tight time frame. We have a year to propose a regulation, and then after that, a year to finalize it. So 2 years after a final risk evaluation, there will be a final regulation in place. Now that's a big change. And one of the great ways to understand it is this flowchart, which is a little bit oversimplified, but it should help you orient yourself through the process of what we've got. The big buckets are prioritization, then risk evaluation, and then risk management. So I'm going to walk through all of them, and we are actually in all of those 3 buckets now, depending on which group of chemicals you're thinking about. The first one is prioritization. How does EPA identify what chemicals to work on first? There's, depending on who you ask, between 40 and 80,000 chemicals in commerce. There is a list, that TSCA inventory, and then there's the active inventory, but there's a lot of chemicals. So how do we decide which ones to look at first? Well, there's a risk-based screening process and criteria for designating a chemical substance as either high priority for risk evaluation or low priority for risk evaluation. And TSCA does have a few criteria spelled out for the process for what we're supposed to do. And one of the key points is public engagement. There's at least, there's 2 comment periods in the statute. We have the option of doing more. And we really want to know from the public, which chemicals should it be that meet specific criteria: hazard, exposure, persistence, bioaccumulation, and toxicity. Also those that are carcinogenic get special attention. But which chemicals should we look at first? Do they have enough information right now for EPA to conduct a risk evaluation? And then a lot of other considerations. So I do want to emphasize prioritization is a public process. We're trying to be transparent, and hopefully any of you that engaged in the prioritization process throughout 2018, 2019 did see that, and you have ideas for how to continue to engage in the future. What happens in prioritization is a chemical can only go 1 or 2 ways. It's either high priority for risk evaluation, or it's low priority, which means we are not going to be evaluating it at this time, and it goes to the end of the line, at the very, very end of all of them. High priority means we engage in the process of risk evaluation, and that we have concluded that this is a chemical really worth investigating. And it starts on that treadmill the risk evaluation process. So in terms of our current prioritization actions, we did in 2019 designate 20 substances as high priority for risk evaluation. We also designated 20 substances as low priority. So we've identified them. They are on our website. And so we have been pretty clear about here is what's going to happen with the 20 we're looking at starting in December 2019. And so they're in their early stages of risk evaluation now. And then also 20 that are low priority, and they're not going to be evaluated any time in the near future. Okay. So that brings us to risk evaluation. I mentioned that there's 20 chemicals that have started that process. There were also 10 because the statute really wanted us to start work immediately. There were 10 chemicals that were selected by the administrator in late 2016 without the prioritization process. And the statute specified that. It said the EPA administrator shall identify 10 chemicals right away and start working. So I'm going to list those 10 chemicals pretty soon. But those chemicals that we've been working on since the end of 2016 are now in their very, very end stages of risk evaluation. They're in final risk evaluation phase. We've got 10 that are wrapping up their risk evaluations. We've got 20 that are just beginning. So the risk evaluation process is pretty long, and I'll describe a little bit more of it, but keep that in mind. There's 10 that are finishing up, and then there's 20 that are starting, and they're all kind of moving. And as they finish, another group of 20 starts back up. There's also a process where manufacturers of chemicals can request that EPA conduct a risk evaluation, and there's a few chemicals going through that. So a lot of chemicals in these pipelines going through it. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the risk evaluation part. So in a risk evaluation, which can take between 3 to 3.5 years, EPA must evaluate the risk presented by a chemical under the conditions of use and determine if a chemical presents an unreasonable risk of injury to health or to the environment under those conditions of use. And we're supposed to do that without considering costs or other non-risk factors. It's just about the risks. And we're also supposed to focus on susceptible subpopulations, potentially exposed or susceptible subpopulations that are relevant to that evaluation. And also every time we finish a risk evaluation, there has to be another chemical to take its place. So this graphic, if you do like graphics, it might help explain the process a little bit more. Going from prioritization, if a chemical is identified as high priority, or like I mentioned, those first 10 chemicals, they didn't go through that public prioritization process. They got hand selected and they dropped in. Or there's the manufacturer request option, the way the chemical gets in. But one way or another, those 3 types go into that big risk evaluation process, which starts with a scope document. What's the scope of the risk evaluation? What's going to be in? What's going to be out? What are the conditions of use? I'll talk about that a little bit more, but basically, how is the chemical used? What is its life cycle, all the way from manufacturing, processing, using it, disposing, the whole thing. What's in the scope of the risk evaluation? What's EPA looking at? Hazard assessment, exposure assessment, characterizing the risks. And then we put out a draft, a really big document. It is our best work that we can do with the information we have, the draft risk evaluation, out for public comment and peer review. When that's completed, we produce a final risk evaluation that responds to that peer review, the public comment, any new information received. So that whole process takes between 3 and 3.5 years. And at the end of it, we have an unreasonable risk determination. Does the chemical under the conditions of use present an unreasonable risk or no unreasonable risk? And we're doing that for each condition of use. And I'll get into what happens with unreasonable risk or no unreasonable risk, but this is the risk evaluation process in a nutshell. Now, what's not in that box is actually the important back and forth and the information that we get from you and from anyone else in the public about these chemicals that we're looking at. So what we are very, very interested in learning from people who use the chemicals, who make them, who dispose of them, who have any kind of knowledge is, first, what are the conditions of use? How are people using these? And again, it's manufacture, process, distribution, use, disposal, and release. We do have a lot of that, and we're taking advantage of all the agency resources we have. Obviously, things like the Toxics Release Inventory, the information available under Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, plus our own chemical data reporting rule. But the TSCA land is a big, big place, and especially with existing chemicals that have been out there for a long time, there's a lot of ways that people are using them that we might not be familiar with. And it could also be using existing chemicals in very new ways. We've seen a lot of chemicals being used in things like semiconductor manufacturing, battery manufacturing, things where when the chemical initially emerged in pre-1976, those uses hadn't been considered, but now the chemical is useful for it. So what we need is detailed use information to understand how the chemical is used, the amounts, why in particular. Is it a solvent? Is it a lubricant? Is it a flame retardant? Is it an anti-wear additive? What is its function? How is it being used? In what concentrations? What's the exposure? Who is being exposed to it? In those facilities where it is being used, what is the worker actually doing? What about the people around the worker, frequently referred to as an occupational non-user? What about consumers? Are they using the chemical in their homes, in their cars, in their workplaces? So really, what are the conditions of use of the chemical? And that's our really key thing to understand when we're evaluating it. And that's the information we're really seeking from you and the people you work with. I do want to emphasize this point because getting information early in the prioritization and the risk evaluation process really helps us know what to look at and how to accurately evaluate those exposures, which means we can accurately characterize the risks and make determinations. So we do have a web page that provides some tips on how to submit information to inform prioritization and risk evaluation. So anyone who has information about these chemicals or the types of uses, even if it's not a particular chemical, knowing how a dry cleaner uses things, an auto body shop, a paint shop, what their work practices are, is really helpful in us having up-to-date and accurate information about chemical use. Okay. So I want to pause here and focus for a minute on the first 10. The first 10, which in the branch I'm in, we're working on 7 out of the first 10, helping out with number 8. And just a hint, the ones that we're fortunate to not work on are asbestos and the flame retardant HBCD. So we've got the other ones, and each of them is all is a little bit special in their own way. But I'm curious, what is your experience with any of these chemicals? And if you could run the poll for slide 15, please. And the question is, have you worked with or conducted outreach on any of the following chemicals? You can pick as many as you want.
And Niva, just a little programming note. You will want to tell John when we want to share the results. Last time we didn't get a chance to share the results before we moved on. So there's one more step after we launch the poll.
Thank you.
And you just give John a verbal cue and he'll take care of it.
Okay. Yeah, I think this one should run for about a minute. And okay, yes, if you could end and share the results, please. Wow, that is exciting. So I should have guessed that TCE and PERC would be up there. I have a special relationship with methylene chloride, and so I'm not surprised, but asbestos, that's the winner. I will have to tell that team. And I'm also not surprised to see some of the others are a lot less common, and pigment violet 29 was kind of a head scratcher when it was identified in 2016. But we are working on a risk evaluation for that. So what we've done for these first 10, and it's really great to know what's out there in public awareness or the chemicals that you think would really get a lot of attention is we have been going through that process. Scope, draft risk evaluation, final risk evaluation. We have released 2 final risk evaluations so far. That's for methylene chloride and 1-bromopropane, which is also called N-propyl bromide. And those are out there. I can share the links with you and you can get them through the links at the end of the presentation, but those are final. And so the other ones are on their way to being finalized before the end of this calendar year. They've all completed their draft risk evaluations, their peer review, their public comment period, and we're working to finalize all those and make them final agency actions. Because what happens after a final risk evaluation is actually the really exciting part. But before I get to that, I do want to very briefly touch on the 20 chemicals. So I mentioned that they were starting their risk evaluation process. We actually just published the final scope for each risk evaluation between when I started drafting these slides and right now we actually got it in. So where it says summer 2020, published the final scope. So those have just recently been published and those are all also on our website and in the docket. And what that means is we've identified with public participation what's in the risk evaluation for each of those 20 chemicals. And I haven't listed them here, but if you are interested, there's a lot of flame retardants, more solvents, and a lot of phthalates. Plus a couple of random chemicals, you know, just to make things interesting and also make sure that a lot of different types of exposures and risks are continuing to be evaluated. So we've got 20 chemicals that are starting their risk evaluation process. The scope is out there and it was a really big achievement to get those and also demonstrating that we can ramp up from 10 at a time to 20 at a time, which is where we need to be per the statute. Now, I mentioned the exciting part is what comes next, which is risk management. And that's what I do. That's what the people on the team do. We're part of the prioritization and risk evaluation process, and we are the public outreach for the chemicals throughout their journey in EPA. But what we are is risk managers, and we focus on addressing the unreasonable risks so that they're no longer present. Now, under TSCA, EPA is required to take action to address the unreasonable risks to human health or the environment. And we have to do that, as I mentioned, by rule. And that rule needs to be finalized within 2 years after a final risk evaluation. And there's very specific things we need to look at in terms of considering alternatives, selecting different options, identifying a sort of backup regulatory option, even if we're not proposing it. We really need input from stakeholders, and we are doing a lot of upcoming regulatory activity because of these risk evaluations. Because the key thing is each unreasonable risk identified in the risk evaluation has to be addressed. And if you're familiar with what we've done previously under TSCA, like I mentioned, a lot of PCBs, asbestos, and quite a lot of work on other chemicals, but going into the existing chemicals world and actually regulating the chemicals that people use is not something we've done very frequently. The most notable example was methylene chloride paint and coating removal for consumer use last March in 2019. We finalized that rule. And that was the first in a long time, and one of the first times that we've actually prohibited something from being sold in retail establishments because of the unreasonable risks to human health. So that's the kind of thing that will be happening more and more often, and not necessarily a prohibition and not necessarily retail ban, but yes, EPA will be undergoing rulemakings to address the unreasonable risks because we have this pipeline. We've got 10 chemicals at once, 20 chemicals at once, and not all of them will present unreasonable risks. And not all of the regulations will be similar to that methylene chloride paint and coating removal prohibition. But you are going to see a lot more activity from us. And the scope of what our regulatory options are is here on slide 19. There's a lot of different things we can do. It's basically pretty broad. And if you're familiar with the NIOSH Act and a few others, you'll see a lot of similarities. We do have the authority to regulate the commercial use or the conditions in the workplace regarding these chemicals. Also very far upstream, the manufacturing and the distribution, and then also downstream, the disposal. There's a lot of overlap with some of the other statutes. In a nutshell, TSCA does provide the authority to regulate entities, including the distributors, the manufacturers, commercial users, which is the workplaces and the workers, and the entities disposing of it. But what we can't regulate directly is consumer users. So we can advise, we can recommend, but the regulated entity is usually going to be the person selling to the consumer, or a little bit upstream, the formulator or the processor. Some of the examples of our regulatory options are on the next two slides, and we can set concentrations for what can be in a product that's for sale, prohibitions like I mentioned, require a label, require PPE, require record keeping, which is always important, and then also do things like set an existing chemical exposure limit, similar to a pill, but it would be EPA's exposure limit for what's allowed in a workplace, require monitoring, hazard communication, and also regulate disposal. And these are just examples to give you an idea of the suite of options that are available under TSCA. One other important note is that while we do have an obligation to address the unreasonable risks that we found, we also have to do our homework. And TSCA Section 6C is the least fun part of risk management. And it's basically, we have to characterize certain things to the public and really show you that we've done our work, that we are taking our regulatory authority very seriously, and that we will characterize the effects, the magnitude of the exposure of the chemical to human health or the environment. What's beneficial about the chemical? Why is it being used? What are the economic consequences of this rule? We're also, of course, going to be following the relevant executive orders and also the other statutes that govern how we carry out rulemaking, Administrative Procedures Act, Paperwork Reduction Act, and all of those. But most important is the stakeholder input to inform risk management. We really want suggestions on how we can address the unreasonable risk. Is there someone out there already doing it voluntarily and they have great ideas for how to reduce exposures or manage the risk to these chemicals? Is there a program out there that's putting in place something that we should copy? Are there things that have been tried and failed? Are there alternatives that seem great on the books but aren't? Are the cost information that we have, is it out of date? Is it accurate? So we really want suggestions on what's out there, what we should be doing, and how we can improve our regulatory process or be more transparent. Because that's the key. We really want to be transparent during risk management. We want an extensive dialogue with anybody who is interested in talking to us, and also some people who don't realize it. We're going to be reaching out to small businesses to participate in our small business advocacy review process. We're going to be working with tribes, with states, with local governments as part of this. And a lot of them don't have a lot of experience with TSCA. So that's partly why I'm talking to you, to help facilitate that. If you have information directly yourself, or you know someone who should be engaged as we work on these chemicals or future chemicals, we really want to hear from them. So what we do is we coordinate with stakeholders, we conduct site visits at the invitation of the facility, and we're really trying to develop our network and let people know what we're doing and why they should be involved. So we do have actually 2 upcoming webinars, one on methylene chloride, that is September 16th, and our key risk manager will be walking through what's in the risk evaluation, what were the unreasonable risks we found, and then what comes next. We'll be doing the same for 1-bromopropane, and that's on September 30th. And you can get to registration for those at the links at the very end of this presentation. We're also always open to one-on-one meetings. If anyone wants to come in and talk about these chemicals, we want to meet with you. And we'll be doing invite-only consultations with states and local governments, tribes, small businesses, and environmental justice communities. And that is the end of the presentation. And these are the links I mentioned. And I hope I've left enough time for some questions.
All right, thank you very much, Niva. That was a great presentation. Nancy, do we have any questions coming in?
We do have a question coming in, and Our first question is from John, and he asks, I'm curious why EPA addressed asbestos under the Clean Air Act via NISHAP and under TSCA via ARA.
That is a great question, and I'm going to jot it down. I am very sorry to say I'm not the asbestos expert, but one key feature is that we do have slightly different realms where we work in TSCA and the Clean Air Act. And so I can't speak to that NISHAP specifically, but under TSCA, we can look at, for example, some of the solvents that I'm more familiar with. We do look at the exposures to the worker within a facility, whereas my understanding of NISHAPs is they typically look at the emissions outside. So we can focus on the individual who is using the chemical and their exposures, and really have those two types of authorities work hand in hand to address risks. The other thing is sometimes the TSCA standard is a little different than what's under Clean Air Act or some of the others. And so we might be looking at a different type of unreasonable risk or have a slightly different standard.
Okay, great. Thank you, Niva. And if you are jotting that down, then you'll get us an answer.
Yes.
And what we're doing with some of those is if there are written responses to questions we either didn't get to or need to look up, we are going to be posting those to the website, right on the agenda by your PDF, which is already posted, as well as the recording. So the next question, Niva, is what are the best resources for identifying the uses of TSCA chemicals? For example, who uses them and how it is used, the process or industry. Is that information in the final risk evaluation?
Yes, yes, that is definitely in the final risk evaluation and some of the support documents. But if the question is really which industries, then I would also look at the scope documents, because a lot of times we put some of our initial industry surveys and information in there. But it start with the final risk evaluation. You might have to dig through some of the references to find the appropriate support documents, but there's our economics division does extensive work to identify those. You start with the conditions of use that are in the final risk evaluation, and then that will tell you very generally what it's being used for. For example, it's a processing aid for making agricultural chemicals. And then there's information on what does that actually mean? Who is making this processing aid? Downstream, who is using the chemical once it's in there? So yes, please start with the final risk evaluation. And if there's particular chemicals, we've got right here, the chemicals undergoing risk evaluation, that has the table of the 10 and the 20 and the manufacturer request, and you can find the actual person who is your liaison for that chemical if there's a particular one that you want to discuss.
Great. And I'll just say, add on to that, and Niva knows this because I've told her that we've worked with TCE and we were able to work right with the person at TSCA who was working on it, and they actually presented at one of our roundtables. So I know that our participants really appreciated hearing directly from EPA and the person who was the expert on that.
Great.
Yeah, so I highly recommend you reach out, don't be shy. And the next question that we have, Niva, is from Andrew. And Andrew asks, since you have 40,000 to 80,000 chemicals to look into, are you allowed to say anything or determine anything on chemical X based on chemical Y, for which you have done a risk evaluation when the two are chemicals when the two chemicals are very similar?
That is a great question, and we have been thinking about that in terms of categories. Also, there's a lot of chemicals that could be grouped into a categories, and it's very challenging. The preliminary answer, my understanding, is we have to make a determination on each chemical. We do sometimes have to base our determinations on similar chemicals, on analogs, on data that is collected for a different chemical, and then we apply it to the one we're looking at. But that is a very case by case. I think it would be very hard to say, you know, X and Y, and we're just going to port it right over. So every chemical gets a determination, and it will be a lot. I'm not sure when we will get through all 80,000, but I think we will find ways to do a little bit more of that crosswalk more rapidly. Okay. I'm not sure if you're reading another question. I think you might be on mute, Nancy.
I'm sorry, you're right. I was. I didn't want you to hear my little clicking here. My apologies. So John is asking, how closely does TSCA work with OSHA regarding chemical use and worker protection?
Yes, we work very closely with them, and we really value their expertise. We work with OSHA, we work with NIOSH, to the extent possible, we work with state agencies. And a lot of times, I don't want to say a lot, but of the first 10, several of them already have existing OSHA standards. Other of them have information that NIOSH has developed, or other organizations like ACGIH. So we really rely on their expertise for industrial hygiene and occupational health. That said, we are looking at things under TSCA, and a lot of times our ability to regulate things can be different than what OSHA has. When looking at a chemical exposure in the workplace, for example, OSHA looks at the workplace. We have the authority to look further upstream at the person manufacturing that chemical and what's going on there. So we definitely want to keep working with OSHA and are always trying to expand our collaboration with them. And if you have information on especially occupational health and standards that we should know about, then that's great. Data from the field is always fantastic, and a lot of times what we in EPA have and OSHA has, there's, you know, filing cabinets out in somewhere with monitoring information, and it's useful getting that. So we work with OSHA, and we definitely want to continue that relationship.
Great, thank you, Niva. And John just said thank you. It was another great presentation. So there are at least one more question. So this one comes in, it says, under the websites given, can you find the upcoming seminar information, or is there another link?
Yes, it is the very last link, current chemical risk management activities. And in the middle of the page will be a box, and there'll be one September 16th and one September 30th. And you click on the link to go to Eventbrite, and you have two options. You can listen, or you can also register as someone who wants to make an oral comment. And we're not going to really have too much Q&A. There'll be an opportunity for questions like this, but if you do want to say anything about the chemicals, then you're welcome to. Just please register for that in advance so we can time the day.
Great, and I think we just shared that out to our main audience too. So that was just this morning it came out, I think before 11, so 11 a.m. Central. So it's in your email box too if you are on main. Another question's come in, and we still have a few minutes left. So it looks like we still have 5 minutes at least. So are there any newer chemicals that are likely to be reviewed in the near future?
Newer chemicals. So they go through a very different process. My TSCA hat is telling me it's section 5, but that's not really helpful to people in the real world. But they go through a very different process where they come into our new chemicals management branch and get reviewed before they can start being used out in the world. And it's very different than what we do, which is a lot of the detective work to find out how how a chemical is out there. In new chemicals, they go through Section 5, and typically they would not be eligible for this process that I outlined.
Okay, thank you. Right. So that's kind of on the prevention end, right? Based on what we know now. Okay, another question from Mark. And Mark is asking, based on TSCA pre-publication on January 11th, 2017, it was proposed to prohibit the manufacturing of TCE for the use of vapor degreasers. What is the current status of this proposal?
Very good question. Yes, that was my colleague Tony Krasnick who wrote that proposed rule. Actually, Cindy Wheeler's name might be on it because Tony had a lot to do with the other TCE rule. But that's in the branch that I work, and we all pitched in a little bit on it. The current status, it is still proposed, it has not been withdrawn, but you'll notice in the TCE draft risk evaluation, those same uses are also in the risk evaluation. And while we have the authority to regulate based on those past TCE risk assessments that were completed in, I think, 2013, 2014, we are looking at them under this new Section 6B process where we put them in the risk evaluation. We have evaluated them. In the draft risk evaluation, we did make a preliminary determination of unreasonable risk. And so you'll see in the final risk evaluation, those conditions of use. Can't say one way or another if it's going to be unreasonable risk, but TCE is looking pretty risky. And so then that would move directly to risk management under this new process. So while we still have those proposed rules out there, the conditions of use are in the risk evaluation. And if they're in the final risk evaluation, they'd also be eligible for the rulemaking under the new process.
And Niva, the timing on that, if I missed it, is that at the end of this year?
Yeah, that's our target for all the rest of them before the end of 2020.
Okay, great. All right. I know we have planned a TCE roundtable, and EPA has asked us to wait until January.
Yes.
Because we'll have more information then. Okay, good. Another question has come in. How involved is your program in reviewing PFOS?
Oh, that is a very good question. We are somewhat involved, and I can also direct you to the appropriate people for that, but there is an agency-wide effort on PFOS, and we contribute strongly to it. I think it is being led by the Office of Solid Waste and Emergency Response. I could be mistaken, it could be Office of Water, but we are working on it, and we have a lot of the historic information on it. But I specifically am not, and while our branch has some experience and we're helping, we're not, it's not one of the chemicals that we're currently working on in this risk evaluation process.
Okay, and we have just a minute left here or so, but back to TCE. Mark asks further if you could say anything more about the conditional use exemptions for TCE for certain industry sectors, medical, aerospace specifically.
I'm writing that down. And that is a really good risk management question. And the first thing to clarify, and I'm going to try to do this in less than 2 minutes, is TSCA chemicals, the conditions of use do not include those that are very specifically regulated by FDA. So if the chemical is part of a pharmaceutical drug, if it's part of a medical device, in the case of phthalates, or serving that sort of function, then it's outside the scope of what EPA regulates. And I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is it's basically not a chemical substance under TSCA. It's just totally outside of our realm, and also certain radioactive and other chemicals are just not TSCA substances. But in TCE, I know it is used in aerospace, in degreasing the small metal tubes that are part of medical devices. It's in sort of that manufacturing process. And what would happen with that is in the risk evaluation, we look at the risks. It's purely risks. We don't consider the non-risk factors. How important is this condition of use? How critical is this chemical to the function that's outside the consideration. We look purely at what are the risks, who's exposed, what are the hazards, what's the risk to that person or the environmental receptor at the end of the day. Then we make a determination. If it's unreasonable risk, we move on to the risk management. And that's where we ask the question, and that's where we get information from you. Well, really, what's it being used for? What's the alternatives? How can that exposure and thus the risk be reduced? And getting very outside the realm of this, there's a separate batch of rulemakings we're doing under Section 6 for a group of chemicals. One of them, phenyl isopropylated phosphate 3,1, is used in hydraulic fluids in certain airplanes. And we've gotten very good information that that's absolutely essential to certain aircraft for very high performing functions. And so what we've done in the rulemaking, in the risk management strategy, is really crafted it to accommodate those very important uses where there's not much alternatives, but reduce the exposures and reduce the risk. And so that's where questions about medical devices, aerospace, how is TCE or other chemicals being used, that's where we need information from the public, from the people using it, and seeing how we can tailor things so that what's really essential can continue while reducing the risk so it's no longer unreasonable.
Okay, great. So we are out of time. We had one more question just come in about pesticides. I will email it to you.
Okay, great.
And we'll put it with the answer to the asbestos question.
Great.
But thank you very much, and I'll turn it back to Lisa.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.